Why is it so hard to talk about sex? This is a question that has circulated in my mind for quite some time now. And although our everyday media has a large content of sexual content, it seems as though when the time comes to talk about it seriously, people become evasive. This is especially true if it involves teens trying to learn more about sex. What does this mean? It means that for teens, talking about sex is often avoided and stigmatized. This may cause teens to feel uncomfortable with the topic or even be frightened of sex. And some may think that is actually comforting. I firmly disagree. Throughout this talk, I will explain why teens feel uncomfortable talking about sex, the implications this has on their well-being, and how we can better address this sensitive subject. So, what is it about sex that makes it so awkward to talk about? Why is the very thing that keeps the human race alive something to be shunned? The reason we feel so uncomfortable is because our surroundings are teaching us to think of sex as bad. These surroundings include a variety of influences, but I'll focus on a few here. Let's begin with the way religion has affected our views. Specifically, Christianity, since I was raised in a Christian family and took a religion class based on Christian values. And with over 65% of the US adult population identifying as Christians, many of you here may have heard these lessons before. I was taught that sex makes you impure and sick. Any desire had to be purged. Masturbation meant you were cursed. Having sex before marriage meant you were a sinner, and having a child before marriage resulted in bastard status for the child. Our religious organizations are not our sole influence on our knowledge and views of sex. These lessons are sometimes passed down by your parents as well. The people who are supposed to support us, love us, and teach us are more often the first ones to create taboos and spread misinformation. Let's set the scenario. A child around 8 to 12 years old asks the classic question: where do babies come from? Some parents may provide a made-up story about storks delivering babies, others a special kiss that creates a baby in a woman's stomach. Others may reveal a truthful but harmfully vague description of sex. You might find these exchanges quite familiar. Well, that's because our everyday media has popularized the comedy of this conversation, taking what our parents actually do and portray it to us, such as a scene from Modern Family where we see characters Phil and Claire struggle to speak about sex with their children in a comedic manner. Another great example of this lies in the movie Blockers. And although this movie takes on a more positive approach towards sex in the end, the parents' initial reactions are key. They reflect the way many of our parents would have reacted in the same situation. In this movie, 3 high school seniors are planning to lose their virginity. But when their parents find out their plans, they react with disgust and horror, stopping at nothing to prevent their daughters from committing the worst mistake of their lives. In these scenes, instead of taking a more positive approach and having an open conversation with their children, we are taught that sex is something that should be avoided at all costs. In reality, parents are the ones who are supposed to teach us, but sometimes they don't always succeed in this task. Spreading misinformation, creating taboos, or potentially worse, not bringing up the topic at all. But what about those teens who are receiving no information from their religious organizations nor from their parents? A child or teen who is curious will most likely begin research themselves. They will inevitably find pornography. A child or teen consuming this content is likely to get the wrong message from it. Pornography is meant to be entertainment, not educational. But as you can imagine, an uninformed teen is not aware of this, and they might perceive what is in pornography as what sex really is like, when it's very far from that. This could lead to unrealistic expectations on consent, pleasure, and not to mention an ongoing ignorance on STDs and pregnancies. All of these are examples of the way our surroundings create a negative environment around sex. The mentality of religious organizations and family structures essentially demonizes sex. It makes us feel guilty for any desire. Then that guilt can lead us to being misinformed, which can be dangerous for a variety of reasons. Ignorance on consent, pleasure, STDs, and pregnancies can all lead to someone being put into a difficult situation as an adult, one that could have been avoided. And while some may distance themselves from the topic and the act entirely, others may rebel and start engaging in ignorant sexual acts involving unsafe practices and unhealthy relationships. What does this mean for the individual? I asked a family friend if she thought that parents should be more open talking about sex to their kids. As a mother, she agreed that keeping this topic concealed would be a lot more harmful than helpful. She proceeded to tell me the story of a 14-year-old girl who got pregnant and gave birth. Her mother never talked to her about sex. She had no way of knowing it would cause pregnancy, and a simple conversation could have prevented this. And her story isn't unusual. A study by Advocates for Youth shows that about 750,000 teens become pregnant each year. 82% of those pregnancies being unintended. The misconception that talking to teens about sex will make them more likely to partake in sexual activity could not be farther from the truth. In fact, Deborah Hauser, president of Advocates for Youth, cites research showing that comprehensive sexual education can actually help teens delay sexual initiation while also encouraging the use of condoms and contraceptions when they do become sexually active. I hope that by now all of you have accepted or at least open to the idea that keeping sex a secret is very detrimental. So then, how do we get rid of this perception? I would argue that education in schools might be able to help. But even then, sex ed in schools is greatly lacking in vital information. There's simply way too much missing to provide for effective learning. To begin with, sex ed is usually tied in with a general health class. This means that it only takes up a small portion of the course and is usually taught by someone with little training or inclination to discuss sex with teens. This situation in itself is bound to have a lot of issues. But let's look at what is often discussed in this brief unit. Abstinence only. You know what I was told in my sex ed class? Just don't have sex. Barely any talk about using contraceptions or other resources. Just don't do it. Well, guess what? That won't stop the over 50% of teens who engage in sexual activity before they turn 18. Abstinence until marriage curriculums basically tell teens not to do something and expect that to be enough. I'm sure all of you can see the problem in that. Sadly, this is pretty much present in every sex ed course, with over 37 states requiring information on abstinence. Compare this to only 12 states that require information on contraceptions, and only 7 that require the information be medically accurate. With such irregular standards, it becomes apparent why most teens don't receive proper sexual health education. But there is so much more blatantly wrong with this brief unit. They also don't talk about consent. Something that seems so crucial to talk about is not even discussed. Consent is the first thing to consider. Consent is the first thing to consider when planning to engage in sexual activity. Sex without consent is rape, and preventing such situations from happening can be very beneficial. Further, sex ed classes should also elaborate on the stages of consent. Just because you agreed once does not mean you are open to or comfortable with everything yet, and communicating such concerns should be normalized. Further, if we could teach consent to teens, we may be able to lower the incidence of sexual assault and rape that occur in our country. An article by Grace Tatter states that a recent study from Columbia University's Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation project states that comprehensive sexual education can actually help teens even after high school. By creating a more comprehensive approach towards consent, they'll be less likely to commit and be less vulnerable to sexual violence. Another big issue with sex ed is the complete and utter lack of LGBTQ+ inclusion. Teens that fall on the sexual spectrum are already not included in many areas. But basic sexual health should be prioritized. By disregarding teens that lie on the sexual spectrum, we are causing them to miss out on important, medically accurate information that is essential for good sexual health. An article by the Center for American Progress states that all teens deserve education that empowers them to make healthy, informed decisions on their relationships and their bodies. If we continue to disregard teens that are LGBTQ, we are causing them potential harm in their sex life later on. Further, sex ed classes also fail to discuss intimacy, pornography, sexual assault, polygamy and monogamy, the differences between love and infatuation. In addition, kinks and fetishes are far off this list. Richard Weisbord, an American psychologist, agrees that sex ed in this country is abstinence only or disaster prevention. How to not get pregnant and not get sexually transmitted diseases. It's not about respect and care in a loving relationship. In Weisbord's study, 65% of his respondents wish they had received more guidance on the emotional aspects of romantic relationships in their health and sex ed classes. In short, these classes offer almost nothing to properly educate teens. Finding quality guidance and information on sex in this country is difficult. We must change the way we teach sex in order to give our youth a better chance at success. Maybe we can find ways to encourage religious organizations and schools to promote inclusive sexual education. What we can absolutely control, however, is the way we talk about sex within our families, friendships, romantic relationships. I encourage all of you to open the conversation on healthy sexual practices with your children, students, peers, and anyone who seeks guidance. Do what you can to promote a world where all of us have open access to resources and information. A world where we are not afraid to speak of our sexuality. Why? Because self-worth in sex is not implicitly understood. We must explicitly help others to recognize the boundaries and beauties of sex. Thank you.